Daggerland, Ohio, 1991. George Lost and David Winters were 8 years old, barefoot on the beach with pockets full of rocks they'd been collecting all week. George was the sturdier of the two, already broad through the shoulders, his dark hair falling stubbornly into his eyes as he squinted out at the water. David was a little taller, leaner, with a grin that usually came first and words that came faster. Blonde hair stuck up in the breeze, always a little wild, no matter how many times his mom tried to calm it down. Where George liked to study the water, David would rather test it, skipping stones farther, wading out deeper, daring George to follow. That night the lake was calm, washed pink with the last light of the day. The boys had chased each other down from the bluffs, seeing who could reach the shoreline first. Out of breath, George bent to retrieve a flat stone when David's voice cut off mid-sentence. "George," he said quietly. George followed his stare. Something had washed up on the beach. At first, he thought it was just a fish, a big one, bigger than he'd ever seen. But the closer they got, the more it looked like something was wrong. Its belly was torn open, ribs showing white in the dusk, the insides gone, and the marks along its scales, not teeth, not a propeller, but long raked lines like claws. They stood there, the surf slapping at their ankles. George's stone slipped from his fingers. "What did that?" David asked. George shook his head, though the truth was he didn't want to know. "Maybe a bigger fish," he muttered. "No fish does that," David replied, crouching closer, eyes locked on the marks. Nervous, George kicked sand at it, forcing a grin. "Come on, let's go back up." But David kept staring. Later, as adults, they wouldn't remember finding that fish. What they would remember was the feeling that summer, the hush of Lake Erie, and the sense that something was out there. Daggerland, present day. David Winters worked lake patrol on Lake Erie. Some shifts ran through the day, checking buoys, logging currents, towing in the fishermen whose engines gave out. Other shifts went through the night, when the curfew breakers, drunks, and kids with more nerve than sense came out. Either way, if there was work to do on the lake, David was the one sent out. Daggerland only had a handful of working boats left, and David's two were the only reliable ones. One was the county's Boston Whaler Guardian, the 27-footer he used for patrol. The other was his Cal 39 sailboat, Claire, tied up at the dock like a memory he couldn't let go of. The rest of the fleet was junk, skiffs patched more times than painted, fishing boats that rattled apart in rough water, one old trawler that leaked oil so bad you could follow its rainbow sheen from the marina clear out to the bluffs. If you needed a boat you could count on, you went to David. The patrol boat was not pretty. Fiberglass hull, twin outboards, a floodlight bolted to the bow. Loud but dependable, the kind of boat you sent out when the lake started taking more than it gave. Most shifts were quiet. A curfew breaker, a drunk stalled in the harbor, kids testing themselves against the dark. But after Samantha, after Josh, after the Harpers, quiet did not mean safe. It meant waiting. Since Samantha Granger went missing, nothing in town had felt the same. She was 8, and her footprints just stopped near the bluff. No body, no signs of a struggle. It was like the lake opened up and took her whole. 2 days later, Josh Maddox disappeared, and though he came back alive, it wasn't without a cost. George and David saw something that day on the shoreline. Tall, grinning, claws in the mud. And then the Harpers tried to run. Their SUV died out on Lake Road, and by the time help reached them, The parents were gone. Only the kids survived, thanks to the town mechanic, Marcus Wilkins. That's what Daggerland had become in just a matter of weeks. A place where the lake didn't just take lives, it swallowed families whole. And that was when Sheriff George Lost laid down the rules. Stay out of the water. No walking the shoreline alone. No kids near the bluffs. If you saw something, you called the sheriff. Those rules hung over Daggerland like a curfew bell everyone heard, whether they wanted to or not. But rules only went so far. George still had to walk the land. David still had to patrol the water. They didn't have a choice. Most shifts started the same. David cast off from the marina, the whalers' twin outboards coughing once before settling into their steady hum. First stop was the buoys, circling them one by one, making notes on which were drifting out of line or needed new paint. That morning, he hauled a fisherman back in after his motor gave out halfway to Palmer's Bluff. The man muttered about bad fuel and kicked at his tackle box the whole ride, but David didn't press him. He just dropped the guy at the dock, filled out the tow report, and moved on. Later, he spotted a couple of teenagers in a dented skiff, trying their luck where they weren't supposed to be. Not far from the rocks, lines dangling into the water like they were after perch. David eased up alongside, told them to pack it in, and didn't leave until they were headed back toward town with sour looks on their faces. It wasn't glamorous work. Most shifts were like this. Drunks, kids, busted motors. But David kept at it. Every pass across the lake a reminder that quiet didn't mean safe. By late morning, David had tied the whaler off, filled out his logbook, and driven the few miles back inland. He liked living away from the shoreline, where the air smelled like grass and pavement instead of weeds and brine. At night, cicadas were the loudest thing you heard, not the steady breathing of the lake. He'd barely swung the truck door shut when the screen door banged open and Owen came barreling out of the house, glove already on, his dog Crichton trotting close behind. "Dad, catch!" Owen held up the ball like it was a badge. David gave a tired smile. "You don't waste any time, do you?" "You promised," Owen said, already jogging backward into the yard. Crichton bounded a few steps after him before circling back, head tilted, as if to make sure David was coming too. David sighed, rolling his shoulders. "Give me 5 minutes." "Sheriff Lost says procrastination is the enemy of discipline," Owen replied. David rolled his eyes. "What is the sheriff, Jocko Willink now?" Owen stood in thought for a moment at that. Jocko what?" "Doesn't matter," David replied, shaking his head and picking up his glove from the porch rail. "All right, let's see what you got." They started throwing easy. Owen's high and wild, but full of energy. Between throws, Owen rattled off facts he'd picked up from George. "Hey, Dad, did you know cops have 10 codes for everything? Like 10-7 means out of service." David snagged the ball from the air. "Yeah? Wait, you calling me out of service?" Owen smiled. David tossed it back. "Yeah, you keep talking like that, and you're going to be writing parking tickets before you're 10. Owen scrunched his nose. I don't want to write tickets. I want to chase bad guys." "Chase bad guys, huh?" David said, grabbing the ball again. "That's a lot of running." "I'm fast," Owen shot back. David sent an easy lob. "Not faster than Crichton." "True," Owen admitted, glove smacking shut as he caught it on the second try. "But George says you don't have to be the fastest, you just have to be the one who doesn't quit." David looked back. Yeah, that sounds like something George would say. They kept tossing the ball until Owen's arm tired out and his throw sagged low. Finally, David clapped the glove shut. "All right, that's enough for now," he said. "Go wash up. Lunch in a bit." Owen thought for a second, then gave a small nod and ran toward the porch, glove still dangling on his hand. Crichton followed closely behind. David watched them go, the house quiet behind him, the yard still. For a few moments, it felt almost normal. George Lost walked Main Street late that afternoon, the sun sitting low enough to cast long shadows off the buildings. Daggerland was unusually quiet. Storefronts that used to stay open until dinner were already dark. Closed signs flipped early, blinds drawn. A couple of folks waved as he passed, but mostly they kept their heads down, locking up, silently hurrying home. He stopped outside Miller's Hardware, the owner dragging the front gate closed with a loud rattle of chain. George gave him a nod and kept moving, his boots heavy on the pavement. The town wasn't deserted, just hushed, like everyone was waiting for something. Back in the cruiser, he thumbed through his phone until Laura picked up. The line crackled a bit. She was still inland, staying with her mother. "Hey," George said. "Just checking in." Her voice was warm, steady. "We're fine. The market was busy this morning, full of people. Everything seems normal out here." "Good, that's good," he said, glancing down Main, where the streetlights hadn't even clicked on yet, and half the houses already sat dark. "Feels empty here." On the other end, Laura hesitated. She thought about the woman she'd seen at the market earlier, a young mom with a toddler tugging at her coat, the way she'd bent to fix the child's hat, gentle, patient. It had cut sharper than she expected, left an ache she carried with her all day. Pregnancy tests tucked under her bathroom sink flashed through her mind, one after another. The waiting, the disappointment. The way George never said much about it, but she could see it on his face. She didn't say any of that now. Instead, she asked, "Any updates?" George rubbed at his jaw, eyes drifting down the empty street. No, nothing new. Folks are staying inside. Deputies are making their rounds." He let it hang there, vague. Like if he didn't put details to the fear, it couldn't grow. Laura was quiet for a moment. "Be careful." Neither of them said what they were really thinking. I should let you go," she said finally. "You've got work." "Yeah," George began. "Get some rest if you can." "I'll try," she replied. The line went dead, leaving George staring at his own reflection in the windshield. For a moment, he sat there, listening to the creak of the cruiser settling and the faint hush of wind in the trees. Then he started the engine and eased it back onto Main Street. Later that day, David was on evening patrol. In truth, he was on most of them. The county technically called it a roster, but that made it sound bigger than it was. In reality, David handled nearly everything on the water. There was one alternate, a part-timer from Ashtabula, who showed up when he felt like it. But most nights, most days, if something happened on Lake Erie, it was David's problem. He'd put in a few hours that morning, caught some sleep in the afternoon, and by dusk he was back at the marina. That was the rhythm of it. Sleep in chunks, eat when he could, and try to keep the house from feeling too empty in between. Whenever David had a shift, Owen went with his grandfather. It had been that way since Claire died. Joe only lived about 5 minutes away, and he never once complained about picking the boy up. If anything, he seemed glad for it. He'd take Owen out to eat at whatever diner was still open, or walk him through the yard teaching him how to stack wood and tie knots. Owen loved it. The boy lit up when Joe's truck pulled in, like it was the best part of his week. David knew that his son loved him, but the kid adored his grandfather. With Joe, there was always time for play or a lesson. With David, there were patrol logs, radio calls, and the lake pressing in at every hour. When Joe came to the house, the two men barely spoke. A nod one way, a nod back, a quick, "You good?" before Owen and his dog scrambled into the truck. Their history sat between them. They didn't pick at it, didn't name it. David went to work, Joe took the boy, and that was how it was. The Guardian sat rocking gently at its slip, fiberglass hull creaking against the pilings. David stowed his clipboard and a thermos of coffee under the console, checked the spotlight, the radio, the fuel. Habit more than anything. If something went wrong out there, you didn't want to find yourself unprepared. He throttled out of the harbor, the outboards growling as the lights of town fell away behind him. Lake Erie stretched wide and black ahead of him, the sky dimming into shades of purple. Out here, the rules meant nothing. Out here, it was just him, the water, and the creatures beneath. The first hour passed quietly. He logged a buoy off its mooring, noted a large drifting branch that could cause trouble for small boats. A lone gull circled and settled on the waves, its cry reminding him he wasn't the only living thing out here. He leaned back against the bench, scanning the horizon. The air was calm, carrying that watery tang that always came off the lake after sundown. It was the kind of night where you could almost let your guard down. Almost. David was mid-turn, spotlight sweeping over the surface, when he saw it. A thin gray wisp rising into the twilight sky. At first it looked like a low cloud, but it didn't move with the wind. It went straight up. Smoke. He sat forward, adjusted the throttle. The whaler surged ahead, cutting a narrow wake across the flat water. The column of smoke grew as he drew closer. It moved low across the water, heavy and black, carrying the stench of burning fuel. As the whaler pushed on, the outline of a boat rose out of the haze. The old trawler. Even from a distance, David recognized it by the sag of its stern and the slouch of its cabin roof. Frank Greeley's wreck. Everyone in town knew it. Frank lived on that trawler, although everyone in Daggerland pretended he didn't. Officially, he had a small apartment above the laundromat, but anyone who spent more than 5 minutes near the docks knew better. The boat was patched with scrap aluminum in places. Its cabin roof tarred and tarred again, windows stuffed with yellowing insulation to keep out the wind. Inside, the galley table was cluttered with beer bottles and half-fixed radios, the bunk stacked with greasy blankets and dog-eared magazines. Messy didn't begin to cover it, but somehow the thing stayed afloat. Frank knew enough about engines and wiring to keep her running, and when someone's outboard sputtered, he was usually the first with a wrench in his hand. The wreck was his, and he was going to make sure she lived as long as he did. But now its backside was burning. Flames licked up through the decking around the engine compartment, sparks bursting like gunfire every few seconds. The hull groaned with the heat, the sound carrying across the otherwise still water. David throttled down just short of it, letting the whaler drift a few yards closer. The hot smoke hit his face like opening an oven. He coughed once, pulled the radio mic, and pressed the button. "Hey, George, you there? It's David. I got eyes on Frank Greeley's trawler. Stern's on fire. He's still aboard." Static broke. Then George's voice came through, tight and quick. "How bad?" "Bad. Engine housing's cooked," David replied. "You want me to send anyone?" George asked. Nah, by the time they got here it'd be over," David said. He clipped the mic back in place, grabbed a coil of rope, and edged the whaler alongside. Frank staggered into view near the port rail. His face was streaked with soot, hair singed, coughing so hard his knees buckled with each fit. He waved one arm, more panic than signal. "Frank!" David shouted. "You gotta jump!" Frank shook his head violently, tried to speak, and doubled over hacking. David looped the line in one hand. "Then grab this!" He heaved it across the narrow strip of water. Frank reached, missed, and nearly pitched forward into the flames. For a sick instant, David thought he was gone. Then Frank clawed at the rope, both hands seizing it like a lifeline. All right, hold tight," David said, as he braced his boots against the gunwale and held the rope steady. Frank half climbed, half fell over his own railing, smacked hard against the whaler's side, and David leaned out, hooking his arms under the man's shoulders. Come on. He dragged him up and over, both of them collapsing onto the whaler's deck. Frank's skin was hot, his shirt scorched in places, smoke still rolling off him. Behind them, the trawler gave a deep metallic groan. Something inside the stern popped loud enough to rattle David's teeth. A split second later, the back half of the boat belched fire, a muffled boom pushing a wave of heat out across the water. Shit! David scrambled upright and shoved the throttle forward. The whaler roared ahead, wake chopping the surface as the trawler's flames climbed higher, twisting orange against the dark sky. Frank rolled to his side, gagging, clutching at David's leg. His eyes watered, his voice raw. It wasn't the wiring. This ain't my fault, Dave. He rasped. He coughed hard, then forced it out again. Something hit the hull hard, right before it went. David stared down at him, heart pounding, the words hanging between them. His eyes lifted to the water. The whaler's wake spread out behind them, white foam already settling back into black glass. Nothing moved out there. No ripple, no shadow. Just the steady hush of Lake Erie. Still, David slid his hand to his sidearm. He knew it wouldn't do much good if the thing decided to move now, but the weight of it steadied him all the same. He hadn't even carried one before all this, but George had insisted. Better to have it and not need it, the sheriff told him. And so the pistol rode with him now, every minute of every patrol. Frank coughed beside him, rolling weakly onto his back. The trawler was burning itself low on the horizon now, flames throwing a dull orange glow before collapsing inward with each groan of the hull. David kept one eye on it, the other sweeping the dark water, waiting for something to break the surface. But nothing did. After a long minute, he leaned over, grabbed the mic, and thumbed the button. George, it's David. I got Frank aboard. He's alive, but in bad shape. Trawler's finished, heading in now. Static popped. Then George's voice came through, clipped. Yeah, copy. I'll meet you at the dock. David hung the mic back in place, eyes still scanning the water until the marina lights flickered faintly ahead. The whaler nosed into the marina, its running lights casting thin beams across the pilings. George stood near the edge of the dock, posture set, watching as David eased the patrol boat into the slip and tied her off. A couple of townsfolk lingered farther back, drawn by the smoke on the horizon. They didn't say anything, just shifted from foot to foot, eyes on the water, like they were looking for answers. Doc Graham was there too, medical bag in hand, his silver hair catching the moonlight as he waited. He stepped aboard as soon as David secured the lines and crouched beside Frank. After a quick check, pulse, breathing, burns, he gave a short nod. Frank would live. That was all anyone needed to know. George came up the deck and looked down at the wreck of a man sprawled across it. His clothes were blackened, his face streaked with soot, but he was breathing. David stood off to the side, gloves still on, sweat mixed with the damp from the spray. His eyes didn't leave the lake. No sign of it? George asked finally. David shook his head. No, but he swore something struck the hull before the fire. George studied him. Did you see anything? David hesitated, then said, No. That was it? No more words between them. The ropes in the slips creaked with the slow rock of the boats. Water tapped quietly at the pilings. And somewhere farther out, a gull cried once before going silent again. Doc Graham and two volunteers lifted Frank with practiced care and carried him off the deck. They moved slowly, careful with every step along the narrow boards until they reached the waiting truck. Frank's coughing echoed off the buildings, harsh and uneven, before the doors shut and the sound faded. George let out a slow breath. All right, go home and get some rest. David didn't reply. He only watched the horizon, a flat line over the black water. Owen was in his grandfather's kitchen when David came by later. The boy sat at the table with a plate of food half finished in front of him, legs swinging, while Joe stood at the counter rinsing a coffee mug. Crichton lay stretched out on the rug nearby, the black German shepherd's head resting on his paws, ears flicking whenever Owen moved. Joe didn't glance up when David stepped through the doorway. He gave a quick nod in his son's direction, nothing more, before turning back to the sink. Dad, Owen said, brightening. Grandpa showed me how to stack wood without it falling. He said I did it better than him. Grandpa Joe smiled faintly at that, drying his hands on a towel, but the expression faded quickly. He reached over, squeezed Owen's shoulder, and told him to finish up before the food went cold. David leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Yeah, that's good. It's been a long night, he said. Joe's eyes flicked over at him. These rules George laid down, he began. This talk about monsters in the water, you don't actually believe it, do you? David didn't answer right away. He glanced at Owen, then back at his father. I believe something's out there, he said finally. Joe's face hardened. Oh, don't start with that. Don't go filling the boy's head with nonsense. The room went quiet. Owen shoveled another bite into his mouth looking anywhere but at them. When the boy was finished, Grandpa Joe sent him down the hall to gather up his things. Crichton padded after him, nails clicking on the floorboards, a quiet shadow at the boy's side. When Owen's footsteps faded, the house was still. David and Joe stood a few feet apart. They didn't argue, not yet, just silence, and the weight of everything unsaid. A few minutes later, Joe pushed his chair back.
"Why don't you let him stay here tonight? You look terrible."
David gave him a quick look back, tired but sharp. He almost said no, but stopped himself. Owen was happy here. He was safe here. "Yeah, okay, fine," David said at last. Owen perked up, trying to hide his excitement. David managed a small smile, but it didn't quite hold. Watching the boy light up in Joe's house cut deeper than he wanted to admit. He missed his son. He wished he was better at this. Better than long hours. Better than tired nods at the end of a shift. Part of him was jealous of how easily Joe gave Owen what he couldn't. But he cared more about Owen than his own pride. And the truth was simple. Joe took good care of the boy. Still, it cut some to know the boy seemed easier here than he did at home. The next morning, the weather had turned. Low clouds dragged across the lake, heavy and gray, and a damp chill carried inland on the wind. It wasn't raining yet, but the air had that bite that said it wouldn't be long. At Daggerland Community Hospital, Marcus Wilkins wasn't resting. He hadn't shut up since they brought him in. The nurses rolled their eyes, smirked at each other, but none of them told him to stop. They liked the old mechanic, even like this. George and David stepped into the room together. Marcus spotted them and tried to sit straighter, winced, then went on anyway.
"You saw it too," he rasped.
His eyes darted between the two men.
"Don't stand there and act like you didn't. I know what I saw."
David didn't say anything, but he didn't look away. Marcus jabbed a finger weakly against the blanket.
"My granddad used to talk about Lake Erie. Said it wasn't just storms that took men back then. Said some nights you'd hear something move under the ice. Told me once a whole fishing crew went missing out by the islands back before the war. The boat was just floating out there, completely empty, no one aboard. They blamed drink or some sickness that drove the men crazy. But the old folks knew better. They stayed off the water at night. And I will tell you something else," Marcus said quietly. "Back when he was 16 or so, my granddad and his best friend, Henry Drake, used to go ice fishing every winter. They'd go out on the ice, set up a tent, drill a hole, and set their lines. They usually snuck out with a few bottles of beer. Well, as it happens, nature called, and my granddad stepped out of the tent for a couple minutes. When he came back, his friend was backed up against the tent wall, as far as he could get from the hole in the ice. One of the poles was gone, and the other snapped in half. Henry was as white as a sheet. When my granddad asked what happened, all his friend would say was, "We have to go. We have to get off the ice. Now." When they finally made it back to shore, Henry said that something was moving fast under that ice. It came to a dead stop under the hole, and Henry said, whatever it was, looked up at him for what seemed like a long time before it moved away. It scared him so bad, Henry never set foot on the ice again.
George shifted in his chair. "Stories," he said. But even he didn't sound convinced. Marcus barked a laugh that cracked into a cough.
You call it stories. I call it warnings. They've been here longer than us, and they don't forget. That thing wasn't just hunting. It was watching, choosing, like it's always done.
George leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Stories, huh? Any of those stories say how to kill it?" Marcus met his eyes, the corner of his mouth twitching, like he almost wanted to laugh.
Kill it? Well, I'll think about it.
He shook his head faintly.
My grandfather never talked about killing, just surviving, staying off the water after dark. That was the only rule.
David broke his silence.
We shot it. George put rounds right in its chest and it didn't care.
Marcus's eyes flicked open again, sharp despite his injuries.
Of course it didn't. You think you're the first men to pull the trigger on it. They've been trying that 100 years and more. Muskets, rifles, shotguns from duck hunters. It keeps coming.
He coughed hard, winced, but pushed through it.
This isn't some bear you scare off with noise. It knows what bullets are. Knows they don't mean a damn thing.
The nurse shifted at the foot of the bed, rolling her eyes but not interrupting. Marcus raised a trembling hand as if to wave her off.
Let them think I'm delirious. Doesn't change what I saw.
George rubbed a hand over his mouth, leaning back in the chair. Then what? We just wait for it to take someone else? Marcus stared at the ceiling for a long moment, jaw tight. When he finally spoke, his voice dropped almost to a whisper.
I don't know yet, but there's always something. Every machine's got a weak point. Every beast a way to bring it down. You just have to find it.
His hand twitched against the blanket. Grease still worked deep into the lines of his skin. He turned his eyes back on them, tired but certain.
You boys give me time to think. Maybe I'll come up with something. But don't you forget, that thing's been here longer than us. If you go after it, you better mean it. And if what my grandfather said was true, and it is starting to look that way, better men than us have tried to kill this thing. And it took every one of them.
The room went still. Just the beeping of the monitor and the voices outside. The hospital doors sighed shut behind them, leaving the hum of machines and Marcus sealed inside. The morning air was cool and damp, but you could smell the lake, even this far inland. George fell into step beside David as they crossed the lot, their boots echoing soft on the pavement. They didn't speak for a long moment. The weight of what Marcus had said was still with them. George finally broke the silence. "He's even tougher than I thought. Most people wouldn't be talking after losing that much blood. David leaned against his truck, arms crossed. Most people wouldn't have gone back for those kids. He looked off toward the horizon, though the lake was miles away. He's not wrong about it, George. You know he's not. George's jaw flexed, but he didn't argue. My job is to keep people steady. If I start repeating stories about swamp creatures and old fishermen's warnings, this town is going to fold in a day. Then what? David asked. We just keep telling people to lock their doors and stay away from the water, like that'll stop it? George sighed, hands resting on his belt. I tell them what they can handle. That's all I can do. David shook his head. Marcus said better men than us have tried to kill it. If that's true, then we've got to be smarter, stronger, I don't know, something. George studied him in the dim light. You think it can be killed? David thought about Owen, and his answer was quiet, but certain. I have to. They stood in the lot for a while, neither pushing the other any further. George finally gave a small nod, then turned for his cruiser. David watched the taillights fade, then climbed into his truck and drove the opposite way, down toward the marina. The lot was empty when David pulled into Daggerland Point Marina. He walked along the creaking wooden planks to where the whaler and Claire waited, his hand brushing the railing of the sailboat as he passed. He stopped at the end of the dock. The lake spread wide under a gray morning sky. The water was flat and pale, the surface rolling in long, slow swells that caught the light like dull metal. Out past the break wall, the horizon blurred into cloud, lake and sky, the same washed-out color until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. He thought back over the previous couple days. He'd hauled Frank Greeley off a burning wreck and kept the old man breathing. Marcus was still alive, thank God. Owen was safe for the night, with his grandfather. Those were wins. They had to count for something. But the lake was still there, dark and brooding. A ripple slid across the water then, too broad and smooth to belong to anything ordinary. David froze. He watched, waited for something to break the surface. Nothing did. The water stilled, flat as glass. He stayed there anyway, staring out into the dark, long after the ripple was gone. The sheriff's office was quiet after midnight, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears. George sat alone at his desk, the green cone of a lamp pooling light across stacks of binders. He told himself he was just cleaning out old files, but that wasn't true. Marcus's words wouldn't leave him. They've been here longer than us, and they don't forget. George wasn't a man who chased ghost stories, but he'd been on the bluff with David, seen the thing stand grinning in the mud, bullets bouncing off like nothing. He'd pulled 2 kids off Lake Road after their parents vanished into the dark, and he'd seen that thing again. If Marcus wanted to talk about warnings, George was in no place to argue. So he turned pages, yellowed clippings, water-stained incident reports, the kind of material nobody looked at unless they were chasing a grant or padding out a museum exhibit. But buried in the mess was a through line. The lake had always taken more than it gave. The Griffin, 1679, the first ship to ever sail the Great Lakes, vanished without a trace. Its captain, LaSalle, called her my greatest undertaking. The lake called her something else, No wreckage ever found. No bodies either. Sailors whispered it was cursed, and the stories carried down the centuries. A ghost ship drifting eerie in the fog. The Marquette and Bessemer No. 2, 1909. A steel ferry carrying more than 30 men across the lake. It sailed into the fog and was never seen again. The papers printed official words, vanished in the storm, but George found the photographs of the recovered lifeboat and the notes. There were more, always more. The lake didn't care if you were a fisherman with a hand net or a captain with a steel hull and an iron engine. The ending was the same. Crews vanished. Families got nothing back but silence. George sat back, rubbed his eyes. These were the ones people remembered. But how many weren't written down? How many were just chalked up to drunk at the helm, bad charts, a storm that came in fast? That was always the explanation. Storm, fog, error, simple answers, easy lies. He flipped to the next binder and found himself staring at November 1913, the Black Friday storm. Over a dozen ships went down across the Great Lakes that week. On Erie, 2 of them vanished with all hands. The W.H. Gilcher, the Henry B. Smith. Official reports talked about wind speeds, freezing spray, waves high as houses. He skimmed the typed language, the stiff explanations. Then his eyes caught something scribbled in the margin of a report, the handwriting rough and hurried. Found the net slashed, not torn, cut clean. No storm does that. George's throat went dry. He stared at the note for a long time, as though the words might shift if he gave them enough time. Slashed, cut. Someone or something had been down there. Marcus's voice echoed again in his head. Better men than us have tried, and it took every one of them. George closed the binder, leaned back in his chair. The desk lamp hummed faintly. The office otherwise silent, but for the tick of the wall clock. Out the small second-story window, past the rooftops of Daggerland, the lake stretched pale under the moon. He didn't say anything, just stood there a long while, staring at the horizon, wondering how many times the town had already lost this fight, and who would be next.